Katarina. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to moderate this session. It's also a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Piotr Kostyło. Professor Kostyło is a philosopher of education, and he is currently director of the Institute of Human Sciences at the University WSB Merito in Torun, Poland. Professor Kostyło is also member of the Committee of Pedagogical Sciences at the Polish Academy of Sciences, chairman of the Polish Pedagogical Society, and member of the Committee for the Protection of Memory of Struggle and Martyrdom at the Gdansk branch of the Institute of National Remembrance. Professor Kostyło is editor-in-chief for the journal Philosophy of Education, and author and translator of an impressive body of scientific works. So during the last couple of weeks, I've had the opportunity to delve into some of these, and I am moved by the clarity of the texts and by the profoundness of the philosophical educational questions, questions that are so important for education, perhaps more than ever today. As these questions lie close to my heart, I very much look forward to this talk, and I think we are in for a real treat. So Professor Kostyło will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we have about 10 minutes for questions, reflections, and discussion. So please, Professor Kostyło, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you very much. And I would like also to say thank you to Professor Aleksandrowicz for inviting me for this event, and that's a real pleasure. And now I'm just going immediately to my presentation. My presentation is Intuition as a Reward for Intellectual Effort, and that will be delivered in English. As I mentioned, I haven't used my French for the 30 years, so it's rather a challenge just to speak and answer questions. I decided to deliver my paper in English, and that now the paper structure is presenting the thesis of the paper. This is the first step. The second is an introduction. There's a traditional dichotomies in Bergson's philosophy. Within that part is an interdependence of intellect and intuition in scientific cognition. Then a common sense as the ultimate goal of education, and Bergson's philosophy is a foundation of liberal education. And finally, I'm going just to conclude in a few words. Okay, this is philosophy of education as a tool for overcoming the dichotomy in Bergson's thought. Good. Now, the thesis of my paper is in today's lecture, I will examine aspects of Bergson's philosophy that are relevant to educational issues. The main argument I want to present and defend is as follows. Traditional interpretations of Bergson's philosophy often emphasize its dichotomous nature, particularly described in terms of the opposition between intellect and intuition. This view, partially constructed by the philosopher himself, can be fascinating and thought-provoking within the domain of pure philosophy. However, it reveals significant limitation when we try to apply it to how humans function in culture, especially in education. As long as we look at Bergson's thought through the lens of the opposition between intellect and intuition, there seems to be little room for its creative application in education. However, the perspective changes when we start to see these two cognitive faculties as complementary rather than opposition. That is, when we acknowledge that intellectual knowledge is actually a necessary condition for intuitive. Within this perspective, Bergson's philosophy unveils its full educational potential, offering teachers and students a uniquely fruitful cognitive experience in areas where many assume human knowledge has already reached its limitation. Building on these reflections, I will address a further question in this presentation, namely, I will attempt to identify the potential of Bergson's philosophy of education for enriching and advancing liberal education, particularly in the context of the needs and challenges faced by contemporary liberal democratic states. Traditional dichotomies in Bergson's philosophy. Henri Bergson's philosophy continues to resonate with readers, particularly through his ideas on time, consciousness, memory, and intuition. His contributions to morality and religion have also been highly influential. What unites this concept is their spiritual orientation and their profound connection to the direct experience of life. Both perspectives, though distinct, challenge intellectualism understood as perceiving reality primarily through conceptual and quantitative lens. So in relation to these two perspectives, some scholars consider Bergson as a representative of the philosophy of spirit, while others see him as a proponent of the philosophy of life. In either case, he is widely recognized as a critic of rationalism. However, it must be emphasized that his critique does not dismiss the importance of rational knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge. Instead, it highlights its limitations when applied to metaphysical inquiry. This distinction is a fundamental aspect of Bergson's thought and must be considered in any analysis of his philosophy of education. That is, I will not explore this aspect in detail here, as it belongs more to the realm of pure philosophy than to the philosophy of education, which is my primary focus today. I shall add, however, that such a portrayal of Bergson's philosophy invites us to view it as a protest against naturalistic conceptions of science, a protest raised in the name of spirituality, freedom, and creativity. This perspective helps us to understand the central tension in Bergson's work between intuition and intellect. Intuition as a way of knowing allows us to grasp reality in its dynamic process of becoming, in its qualitative aspects, and, most importantly, in a direct and immediate way. By rejecting the idea of interpreting the world solely through intellectual categories, especially those derived from mathematics, Henri Bergson quickly gained a reputation as a leading European irrationalist. In the early 20th century, this label was both influential and long-lasting. To this day, Bergson's philosophy continues to be closely linked with various dichotomies such as determinism versus freedom, brain versus mind, passive matter versus vital life force, along with closed morality versus open morality, and static religion versus dynamic religion. In this contrast, the first terms are associated with intellect, while the second are connected to intuition. As a result, Bergson's philosophy is often seen as giving priority to intuition over intellect, minimizing the importance of rational knowledge and emphasizing the possibility of a direct connection between humanity and the ultimate principle of life, which in Bergson's view is God. In other words, the message conveyed by Bergson's philosophy is that human beings are meant to, for more than simply measuring and quantifying the world around them. It suggests that we have access to inscrutable depths of knowledge, experiences that transcend everyday joy and sorrows, and to mystical states that elevate us beyond ordinary existence. In this context, positivist science, which seeks to control material reality and explain or predict natural phenomena through mathematical formulas and equations, seems secondary. This epistemological dualism between intellectual knowledge and intuitive knowledge emerges as a key issue when applying Henri Bergson's philosophy to educational practice. Within the educational framework, intellectual knowledge is often perceived as less noble, even insignificant, while intuitive knowledge is elevated to a position of supremacy, regarded as highly desirable and even symbolic of life's ultimate privilege. Such an approach tends to marginalize intellectual knowledge, leading to an exclusive emphasis on intuitive knowledge. As a result, subjects that are mathematically oriented, including not only mathematics but also the natural sciences such as physics, are devalued in teaching. Instead, greater emphasis is placed on disciplines that allow students to express their individuality and creativity. In this context, Bergson's philosophy has become a significant influence on alternative pedagogical approaches, particularly those that challenge the traditional prioritization of mathematical and scientific subjects in public education. This tendency extends beyond formal education to the broader realm of upbringing. Bergson himself Bergson himself addresses this issue in the two sources of morality and religion, where he analyzes two models of education. At the conclusion of the first chapter, Bergson acknowledges that the possibility and necessity of intellectual reflection on morality. However, he simultaneously observes that such a reflection is secondary to the moral intent itself. He therefore poses the critical question, how will influence be exerted on the will of a student? In answering, he identifies two distinct paths available to the educator, stating that, as I quote, the two paths are open before the educator. The first is the path of discipline or training, a term used here in the most noble sense. The second is the path of mysticism, a term conversely used here in the most modest sense. The first method instills morality through the formation of impersonal habits. The second method inspires the imitation of a person or even the cultivation of a spiritual bond, culminating in a partial or complete unity with that individual. Bergson then proceeds to elaborate on both paths. I quote, primitive discipline or training, the kind of occurring by nature, consisted of adapting the habits of the group. It was automatic and occurred spontaneously whenever the individual felt partially integrated into the collective. As society became increasingly differentiated through the division of labor, the groups within society were entrusted with the responsibility of disciplining the individual and maintaining harmony between the individual and the group, and thereby between the individual and society as a whole. However, this always entailed a system of habits acquired solely for the benefit of society. Undoubtedly, this form of morality may eventually be sufficient as long as it is fully realized. The second method of mysticism, according to Bergson, may complement the first as needed and may even replace it. Again, I quote, we do not hesitate to call it religious, even mystical, but we must agree on the meaning of these terms. We are not referring to its content alone, a mere intellectual image. That is to say, the content of the intellectually developed metaphysics. Here, something else emerges that supports this image and imparts to it, I am not sure how, effectiveness. This something is a distinctly religious element. From this point forward, it is this element, not the metaphysics, with which it is associated that becomes the religious foundation of morality. Of course, we are dealing with the second method here, which pertains to the mystical experience. Indeed, we wish to discuss the mystical experience as it is manifested in what is direct and unmeditated beyond any interpretation. End of quote. After such a presentation of the two methods of education, I wonder whether any member of the audience would wholeheartedly advocate for training over the mystical experience. As for Bergson himself, he leaves no doubt about which method he favors, portraying the spiritual and or mystical bond between the master and the student as one filled with nobility and passion, directly describing their connection as love. Having read this passage from the two sources of morality and religion, what conclusions can we draw about the ideal model of education for human beings? Does it not compel us to reject training in favor of the mystical experience? Does it not compel us to reject socialization in favor of creating a new morality, habit in favor of personal calling, and necessity in favor of freedom? Bergson's suggestion to replace traditional training with mystical education alongside his earlier belief in the special nature of subjects that foster creativity in students is intellectually appealing at first glance. However, this idea has led to significant confusion within the field of educational theory. It has distanced the French thinker from the theory of cultural transmission and positioned him solely within the framework of pedagogical romanticism. In other words, by emphasizing mysticism over structured learning, Bergson seems to undermine the role of cultural heritage and practical knowledge in student development, aligning more with the romanticized view of education that prioritizes individual spontaneous creativity over established educational traditions. Indeed, his consideration regarding education conceived outside the societal context in which it occurs appear peculiar. At this point, I would like to return to the notion of Bergson's dualistic approach to philosophy and argue that the epistemological dualism between rationalism and intellectual knowledge and irrationalism and intuitive knowledge is not the only possible one, nor is it, as it seems, the approach closest to Bergson himself. Many of the French thinkers' texts suggest that Bergson was not opposed to rationalism itself, but rather to what is known as a reduced rationalism, a product of of, post-Cartesian thought that strips the subject of any spiritual dimension. According to Bergson, man is not only body but also soul. The body can be described using the language of mathematics, but the soul cannot. There is therefore something in human that eludes quantitative description, something that neither mathematics nor the natural sciences can adequately capture. This anti-naturalistic conviction accompanied the French philosopher from the beginning, around which he constructed his philosophy, whether addressing the issues of freedom, memory, life, or morality. There is, however, a fundamental difference between the critique of naturalism rooted in reduced Cartesianism and the critique of rationalism in its entirety. Henri Bergson was far from dismissing rationalism. He only pointed out that rational knowledge does not expose the cognitive possibilities of human beings. Beyond and above rational understanding, intuitive knowledge exists, enabling us to align ourselves with the dynamic flow of life. In his lecture Introduction to Metaphysics, Bergson wrote, I quote, "We call intuition a form of empathy or intellectual sympathy that enables us to place ourselves inside an object in order to connect with what is unique and therefore inexpressible within it. In contrast, analysis is the act of breaking into object down into elements that are already known, that is, those common to it and other objects. To analyze, therefore, is to express something through what it is not. Every analysis is a form of translation and elaboration in symbols, a representation built upon successive points of view. These points of view are as many as they correspond to the points of contact between the new object under examination and other objects already familiar to us. Unquote. The tension between intuition and analysis is the tension between direct and indirect forms of knowledge. Henri Bergson argued that both types of knowledge are accessible to humans. However, intuitive knowledge requires greater effort, as it is less about learning something new and more about unlearning preconceived notions or habitual ways of thinking. We will return to this issue later. For now, let us note that according to Bergson, these two types of knowledge should follow a specific sequence. First, we should analytically explore the issue that interests us, and only then attempt to immerse ourselves in it through a leap of intuition. Bergson explicitly addresses this in his lecture to Madrid students. I quote, the philosophical method as I envision it, consists of two stages and presupposes two successive movements of mind. The second of these movements, the final one, is what I call intuition, a demanding and strenuous effort through which we break free from preconceived ideas and establish intellectual habits in order to place ourselves through sympathy within the essence of reality. However, before reaching this intuition, which is a strictly philosophical operation, it is necessary to scientifically study the context of the issue at hand. Now, this context can be most unexpected. Someone pursuing a particular philosophical path cannot know in advance the scientific problems they will encounter along the way, the fields they must explore to continue their journey. These could be problems arising from mechanics, physics, biology, sociology, or any other branch of science. But what if they are not a mathematician, physicist, biologist, or sociologist? In that case, they must become one. This excerpt from the 1916 lecture clearly demonstrates in what, indeed a very limited sense, one can speak of Henri Bergson as an irrationalist. He was an irrationalist insofar as irrationalism is understood as a completion, or more accurately, culmination of a thorough rational process of knowing. According to Bergson, only after we have positively explored an aspect of reality, examining it from multiple points of view, are we ready to make the final leap and surrender ourselves to intuition, which will take us to the very essence of things. The sequence is therefore clear. First analysis, then intuition, not the other way around. Moreover, intuitive knowledge is impossible without analytical knowledge. Bergson was far from the belief that a person with no orientation in the realm of positive sciences could, through some unknown direct insight, access the dynamic reality. Even if such a path were possible in theory, it would certainly not be feasible for educated individuals, especially for university graduates. The act of intuition, therefore, cannot be seen as a shortcut that exempts one from the rigorous study of the phenomenon in question. Rather, it is the final step in a long series of arduous cognitive endeavors and a necessary step because of the principles of the subjective lived experience of reality, which Bergson calls real duration, la durée réelle, a continuous flow of time and reality that cannot be objectified, divided or quantified. According to Bergson, therefore, the act of intuition requires great effort and painstaking work. One could say that it demands of students the kind of perseverance and dedication that the French philosopher describes at the end of his lecture on intelligence, calling upon his listeners to, I quote, make the most of this learning in every way you can. Resolve firmly to become citizens who are capable of dedicating all your growing intellectual energy to the service of your country. Keep pushing yourselves further, strengthening your inner resolve, and don't hesitate to push your limits when needed. And tell yourself that although overworking is not fashionable, the future belongs to those who overwork themselves. Unquote. Bergson's words about hard work can, I believe, be interpreted to mean that those who wish to experience the act of intuition and thus make direct contact with reality must first thoroughly master the knowledge that science provides about the world. By 1916, when Bergson formulated these ideas, he was already an established philosopher, the author of 3 out of 4 of his major works, as well as numerous key articles that would later be compiled into 2 collective volumes of his writings titled Spiritual Energy, or the Energy of Spirit, and the Thought and Movement. Bergson's national and international reputation was immense. He was a recognized and respected thinker not only in France but throughout Europe and even beyond, particularly in the United States. Speaking in Madrid about his philosophical method, Bergson presented his developed views on the subject. According to him, to begin philosophizing about any topic, one must first analyze the issue scientifically. Such an analysis is essential for many reasons. Above all, it uncovers numerous questions that science has raised but has yet to answer satisfactorily, or questions that have not been raised but should have been. These questions can then inspire further inquiry, innovation, and creativity. Furthermore, analysis clarifies that scientific discussions are driven by tangible benefits for people and that their ultimate goal is to make the lives of individuals and entire societies safer, more comfortable, and more fulfilling. Bergson consistently emphasized that people are generally more focused on obtaining practical benefits from their thinking than on pursuing abstract truth. Furthermore, thinking often emerges not from a quest for truth in the abstract, but from the practical demands of life, which present themselves either as threats that must be eliminated or opportunities that should be saved. As Bergson argues, human thought is driven by self-interest rather than disinterested inquiry. Henri Bergson seeks to convince teachers and students that in addition to the positive explanation of reality, whether natural or social, there is also metaphysical explanation. These 2 types of explanation belong to different orders. This is why the positive explanation based on quantitative relationships and mathematical formulas will never open us to metaphysical experience. Conversely, metaphysical experience which deals with qualitative relationships cannot be confined to mathematical laws. The two orders are related in such a way that the condition for metaphysical knowledge is prior positive knowledge. Only after thoroughly exploring an issue analytically from the perspectives of physics, chemistry, biology, pedagogy, law, history, and other disciplines can we be ready to make the leap into intuition. Indirect knowledge must therefore precede direct knowledge. In other words, analysis must come before the act of intuition. In this sense, the act of intuition represents an additional effort undertaken by teacher and students when the scientific knowledge they have acquired no longer satisfies their need to explain the world around them. The act of intuition requires hard work, as it compels researchers to invest further energy after they have already put considerable effort into analyzing the phenomenon that interests them. In the 1950s, José Marie Mosebasti attempted to overcome the traditional Bergsonian dualism in the field of education. In her doctoral thesis, titled Bergson Éducateur, she proposed an alternative interpretation of the French philosopher's work, aiming to present intellect and intuition not as mutually exclusive, but as complementary cognitive faculties, both equally essential in the educational process. To support her argument, she did not rely on Bergson's major work, but on lesser-known pedagogical texts, particularly his lecture on common sense and classical studies. This relatively modest text on the philosophy of education, according to Mosebasti, becomes a key to understanding Bergson's broader views on education and upbringing. Accordingly, in Bergson's view, common sense contains both intellectual and intuitive elements. If it only consisted exclusively of the intellectual element, it would quickly become a routine. If it consisted only of the intuitive element, it would turn into chimera. Bergson is fully aware of these potential dangers. This is why he emphasizes the necessity of reconciling these two cognitive faculties, as both are essential for navigating and orienting ourselves in the world. This reconciliation is particularly crucial in education, where it is necessary to nurture and develop both faculties equally in students. Given what we have discussed so far, it would be absurd to equip students solely with intellectual traits. But on the other hand, it would be equally misguided to focus exclusively on the cultivation of their intuition without considering the intellectual aspects of their education. Henri Bergson does not assume that it is possible to educate anyone independently of societal expectations, or even more so, to in direct opposition to them. The younger generation, shaped under the guidance of their parents and educators, owes a certain debt to society. This debt stems from the opportunities they receive to benefit from the various goods and advantages provided by society and its educational institutions. In return, society expects them to act in accordance with a common sense. Perhaps we have still 20 minutes, and that's no less.
Yes, we have to leave about 10 minutes at least for discussion.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
20 minutes altogether, and for me, it
Yes,
means
so you
that
have 10 minutes.
I've
Yes.
got 10 minutes. Okay. So then I'm going to skip off. Portions of my presentation, and I'm going just to next slide. That would be about learning and unlearning. What is intriguing in Bergson's understanding of didactics is his concept of learning and unlearning. As mentioned earlier, Bergson placed equal emphasis on both the need for learning and unlearning in education. According to him, unlearning refers to the process of freeing oneself from intellectual habits that hinder access to the direct lived experience of life. These habits include thinking in a routine, mechanical manner and perceiving reality through a rigid system of concepts established by the intellect. At this point, Bergson's distrust of education that relies solely on these fixed patterns of thinking and intellectual concept transmitted in separation from experience becomes evident. And that now I'm just skipping the portion of the text where I explain Bergson's involvement in the French reform of secondary education and his defense of classical languages learning. So, and I'm going to Bergson's philosophy of education and liberal education. So, and in a book chapter titled The Eclipse of a Liberal Democratic State and the Future of Education, published by Routledge in 2024 as a part of a collective volume defending the value of education as a public good, I analyze Bergson's concept of education within the broader context of societal structures. In this chapter, I explore the metaphysical concept of the state developed by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Henri Bergson, linking these ideas to the notions of education proposed by the two thinkers and their relevance within modern liberal democratic systems. In the case of Bergson, as we remember, two concepts of education stand out. Education as training, characteristic of closed societies, and education as a mystical act, characteristic of open societies. Closed societies are structured, rigid, and focused on maintaining order and preserving existing norms and traditions. In such a societies, education primarily involves training and disciplining individuals to conform to societal expectations. In contrast, open societies are more dynamic, flexible, and oriented toward individual growth, innovation, and inclusivity. In these societies, education takes on a transformative and creative role, which Bergson metaphorically describes as a mystical act. Since no human society is entirely closed or entirely open, but rather exists along a spectrum shifting between being more closed or more open, it can be argued that a state promoting the first type of education, that is training, will reinforce societal closure, while the state promoting the second type, mystical education, will foster societal openness. In other words, Bergson's concept demonstrate that education not only mirrors the characteristics of a society, but also plays a role in shaping its trajectory toward either greater openness or greater closure. Furthermore, Bergson's concept of open education as a mystical act aligns closely with the principles of liberal education. Liberal education states cultivate a culture of openness in which liberal democratic states cultivate a culture of openness in which liberal education plays a central role. This form of education emphasizes the development of individuals as autonomous and thoughtful participants in society. It is a process through which individuals acquire and deepen their understanding of knowledge. Such a process cannot be rigidly pre-planned, as it must take into account the unique intellectual and moral sensitivities of each individual, as well as the dynamic changes that accompany personal growth and maturation. In a similar vein, Bergson's concept of open education as a mystical act centers on the individual and their unique cognitive processes, including curiosity, fascination, and the pursuit of personal, intellectual, and spiritual growth. Therefore, both Bergsonian concept of education as a mystical act and the liberal model of education emphasize the importance of individual autonomy and personal development. Both concepts view education not merely as a transmission of knowledge, but as a transformative process that encourages self-discovery, critical thinking, and the cultivation of deeper, more meaningful connections to the world. To illustrate this point, several arguments may be presented. Okay, since we're just nearing to the end of my presentation, so I'm going to address the final point. The Bergsonian distinction between closed education and open education is not dichotomic. Among the infinite diversity of human societies, there is none that would be entirely closed or open. To show us what an entirely closed society would look like, Bergson invokes the example of a beehive or anthill. Although he does not say explicitly what would represent an entirely open society, it can be summarized from this analysis that it would be a community of mystics. In real life, however, we come across societies which contain in themselves both features, and the difference between them consists in what feature prevails, closeness or openness. There are societies which are closing and others which are opening. The reasons why their development is heading towards this or that direction are complex and multi-layered. But in either case, education is pivotal and has much to say. And I think I'm going just to conclude in one sentences, saying that okay.
Hey.
Yes, I think that just now, at the very end, I got a little bit lost because of it, this dynamic of changes, very much Bergsonian concept. And that I'm going to finish now, and I'm going to say thank you for your attention, and I'm giving the floor to you back, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kostyło, for a very interesting and thought-provoking session. I just want to open up the floor by making a short reflection. And I would love to hear your thoughts, Professor Kostyło, but of course all others as well. So I have a reflection that springs from my experiences in various educational contexts, and it concerns what you described as a sequential order of intellect and intuition. So a first context is my experiences in practice and research with children aged 1 to 5. It is my impression that children at this young age make use as much of the intellect as of intuition, but not necessarily in the somewhat timely order you give to these in your talk, first intellect and then intuition. Rather, when you have lived only 1 year on this planet, you seek to make use of both in a more intertwined way, where also intuition can precede the intellect. In this context, it seems of importance to not consider always the intellect as a first instance, not least as pure intellectual instruction often crushes these youngest children's initiatives to study the world. A second context is my experience of educational politics in Sweden, but also in Anglo-American settings, which seems to become more neoliberal and less democratic by each day. This is expressed in a steadily growing set of tools for measuring results, assessing performances, and evaluating educational practice and research. So all these tools appeal purely and only to intellectual rationalizations, sometimes to the point that the tools are no longer in contact with the lived reality in educational settings. So in contrast to what you described in your paper, at least, here there is a completely dominant focus on intellectual knowledge associated with mathematics and the natural sciences. So also here it seems of importance to enhance intuition as a resource in education. And then a third context is, of course, Bergson's own writings in the matter. And here I find it interesting that Bergson describes intellect and intuition as interdependent and even amalgamated tendencies, but at the same time, and in different texts, seems to give slightly more priority to the one or the other. But perhaps also this needs to be understood in context. After having read Emily Herring's beautiful biography of Bergson, I wonder, for instance, if in the many cases where the work was exposed to accusations of irrationalism, perhaps it became necessary to emphasize the priority of the intellect. So I would love to hear more about what you think of this. Is there a given inherent sequential order in the relation between intellect and intuition? Should education always go from intellect to intuition, or do different educational contexts demand that we emphasize the one or the other a little bit more?
Well, thank you very much for those questions. And I try to be short, but well, quite concise and accurate. So first of all, the sequence. Yeah, I mean okay, sequence is important, but in my understanding, what is much more important is just to not mix up those two phenomena. I mean, this the intellect and intuition, and just to open room or open space for intuition themselves, or intuition itself. For Bergson, it was important. And there's the sequence in his understanding of philosophy, of course. That sequence was absolutely necessary, and we know how much time he spent on, reading the stuff of psychology, biology, and sociology, and that even years. At some point, he says that if a philosopher needs 2 or 3 years for study scientifically a subject or an issue, well, she or he must spend the time. So not to mix up those two phenomena. That is much important. That the sequence, and the sequence is important for well, from the point of view of Bergson's understanding of doing philosophy, of philosophizing. For him, it was absolutely necessary because, well, his understanding of philosophy was very much scientific in terms that we build philosophy all together. I mean, step by step. Just none of us should start from scratch, from the very beginning. That is just waste of time. Okay, that would be the first thing. So I agree that the sequence may change, particularly taking into consideration some psychological differences. I mean, connected with our age and development and maturation. Then it was very interesting what you mentioned about liberal democracy, saying that, okay, liberalism, okay, but democracy not so much. And, well, from my perspective, sort of Central European perspective, we are still very much enthusiastic about both of those. And we believe we experience both liberalism and democracy. But that's something for me personally to think about. And thank you for that thread. And accusation about being irrational. Well, recently it came to my mind that that kind of accusation, it came from two sides. The one side is quite obvious. It was a side of analytic philosophy, just Bertrand Russell, for instance, and many others. And also in Poland, we have a Lwów Warsaw School and a very distinguished analytical philosophers, and some of those are very hostile toward Bergson thought. But the second, the second lead of accusation that came from French, I would say, Catholic thinkers connected with, the traditional philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, like Mariett and also others that criticize Bergson for not being rational, because their understanding of rationality, coming from this Aristotelian understanding, it was very handy, to accuse him of not being rational and being purely irrational in his thinking. So he was a victim, I think, and the attack was going from both sides.
Yes.
And well, of course, he was not irrationalist. Perhaps in that sense, I mentioned that irrational entering into experience of life is just a kind of follow up for this scientific understanding. But all those your questions are just
Well,
terribly important.
thank you so much. Thank you. I have Hisashi Fujita that has his hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it was great to have this lecture. Thank you very much, Professor Piotr Kostyło. So I have two questions. The first question is concerning, because you mentioned common sense in education, and for you, common sense is a kind of confluential point between intuition and intelligence. And on the other hand, I'm wondering the relation between common sense and bon sens, because it's not the same thing. Common sense and bon sens. I don't have any words for in English, but bon sens is the very important word for in Bergson's philosophy. And I think we must think about this relation between bon sens and common sense in as a confluential point between intelligence and intuition. It is so the first question. The second question, at the end of your paper, you talked about the foundation, open education as the foundation of liberal democracy. And this word foundation, for me, it's a little bit intriguing, because if open education as a certain, for example, mystics education, something like that, could contribute to liberal democracy, it must contain at the same time, how to say, a certain violence or certain force to re-examine the basis itself of liberal democracy. It's not the same thing to found, to give foundation to liberal democracy. So I mean that in the how to say, in the system of liberal democracy, it must help. But Bergson's educational philosophy must, how to say, exceed this system, I think so. And for example, when Bergson talks about Socrates, I think it's the same thing. It's not in the system of a liberal democracy, but it must exceed and it must re-examine profoundly the system itself So this is why the word of foundation is for me a little bit intriguing. So could you, how to say, help me to understand more? Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your two questions. First of all, this common sense and bon sens. I use common sense, just translating the Bergsonian concept of bon sens, and the quotation I gave, and this understanding, particularly the bon sens having those two, how they put it, ingredients in itself. One is intellectual and intuitive. It's taken from Bergson's lecture. So perhaps this, let's say, this analytically understood common sense, and that well, the bon sens based in the French philosophical tradition. I should have perhaps just explained that this common sense I'm using in the line of the bon sens, and that I don't see any difference between the two within my paper. Okay, if I address you in French, I would use bon sens naturellement. Well, it would be just obvious. So there's nothing incoherent between the two terms. Yes, so that's my first answer. Then about liberal democracy and foundation, and open education as a foundation. So of course this well, let's say liberal democracies today, they need open education to progress, to develop, and that in that line I use the word foundation, because with no open education, we are going to, I mean, sooner or later, being similar to different kinds of autocracy. No, I wouldn't say totalitarian regimes, but here in the Central Europe and Central Eastern Europe, I'm sure that Professor Alexander Vicius just confirms that we are very cautious, about any kind of, authoritarian political systems. And that's a foundation, one of many foundations, of course, not the, this is why I didn't use the foundation, but a foundation, one of many foundations for liberal democracy, and the free thinking and the critical thinking, critical in many terms, of course, but also in the term of being critical towards the government or the political institutions, towards one's state as well. In Europe, we have an opportunity to go just to a tribunal to accuse our own state of being unjust and so on. And it's very much in my understanding, in Bergsonian line, and even more because for Bergson, I mean, the final stage of our development of human being and the species and the human species is just to abolish borders, limits, frontiers, just to have one, I mean, global society of free spirits somehow. And that, again, this open education is absolutely needed, I mean, for that kind of a project. You mentioned violence and force. I'm not entirely sure in which context, and what is the source of violence and the force? The state or education? I'm not sure.
Yeah, because perhaps this term I use a little bit freely, because for me, certain friends of mine here understand. But so for me, the word of violence is implicitly present in Bergson's philosophy, because intuition or duration could how to say, not only give the basis, but also destroy certain established present state. And in this sense, duration or intuition must have this kind of dimension of violence. So in the sense, perhaps, of Solarian sense, yes.
Well,
Okay,
I'm not sure. Okay, I'm
Yeah,
not sure,
okay,
but
sorry. Yeah,
that is a good field for discussion. Thank you
Thank
for
you very much.
I'm trying to get in here because we have run past 5 minutes. So I think, Katarina, even though we have a question from Yashoshi, what do we do?
Maybe if you can be very brief, I think we can get it. But
Okay.
please, thank you, Liselott.
Okay, thank you for your very, so how to say, keen and thought-provoking talk. And what was particularly intriguing for me was the topic of the unlearning. You mentioned in the course of your talk, you mentioned the notion of unlearning during the education. This notion is very important, and yeah, I think. And of course, there is a possible or evident connection to the laughter, because because that work involves the critique of rigid representation and too formalistic schemas in our
sorry, laughter. You mean la rire? Bergson's text.
Yes, Bergson's work. Yes. But what I would like to ask you is that the other notion, that is pure memory. So why? Because the pure memory has seemingly a tension between the notion of unlearning, because pure memory means that everything would be conserved, but in the Bergsonian philosophy of memory, there are two distinct memories, and one is, you mentioned, the habit memories. So habit memory sometimes causes a rigidity, in our intellectual understanding. So, but there's another memory. But Bergson himself did not explicitly relate it to this pure memory, which is how to say, a surplus that remains unorganized as a fixed, some motor memory. So how would you connect this concept of pure memory on the one hand, and on the unlearning in your talk?
I'm not sure if I'm able to answer your question. Thank you for mentioning unlearning. That's absolutely crucial. We all understand that dealing with students and pupils at schools, how important it is for their own development. They come with different conceived habits of thoughts, and that some quite often it's detrimental for their own progress, and that many sort of very rigid, stable, dogmatic views, and that Bergson teaches us just to overcome those views, and that I think that that is something about unlearning, and that school should be able to unlearn students. When I'm thinking of the Polish educational system, I wonder how. It's just perhaps impossible, even it's unthinkable. But okay, perhaps in other countries and states, perhaps it would be more, it would be easier. But about the memory, I'm not able to answer your question about memory and unlearning. And that memory, I like those issues about memory when the Bergson just analyzes the dreams are dreams, and or night dreams, just when memory is free. is not focused on some, life requirements. And then what is important, of course, we know already psychologically what is important, that not images, but our emotions. Well, emotions for me is in Bergson's philosophy something most valuable. But sorry, this is the only thing I can answer. Thanks.
That would be a fantastic topic for a future conference. So thank you so much, Professor Kostyło. Thank you also for the inspiring questions. And thank you again for inviting me, Katarina, and the organizers, Povilas, also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.